couple of summers ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in Chequamein National Forest in northern Wisconsin. And after our experience, we do not plan to return unless with a large group of people. My girlfriend and I are from Chicago, so northern Wisconsin was our go-to place for R&R. We've done a number of hiking trips in northern Wisconsin and up in the UP, but never to this area. We are not backpacking experts, but we have been to a number of national parks and have been out hiking and exploring when we can find time away from work. We absolutely love getting away from people and relaxing in nature. But this trip made us appreciate the presence of other people around us in unfamiliar places. Our plan was to hike a remote section of the North County Trail. The North County Trail is a national scenic trail, just like the Appalachian Trail, but it gets much less use. In some parts of northern Wisconsin, the trail is very remote, and the only access is via logging roads. We plan to hike 15 miles along the trail to a backpack shelter, spend the night, and hike back to the car the following day. We spent the night at a friend's house in Wausau, and we set out early the next day to the trailhead. As we entered the national forest boundary, we were captivated by the beauty of the thick green forests. I drove slowly along the gravel logging roads as we made our way to our parking spot. While we were driving to the trailhead, we passed a couple of people standing next to a parked truck on the side of the road. They appeared to be hillbillies, as they had a rusted-out, bunged-up pickup truck, complete with Confederate bumper stickers. As we drove past, I waved, and they stared back without returning the greeting. Friendly people, I thought to myself. After we passed them, I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed they were still staring at us. And before we rounded a bend, I glanced back into the mirror again, and saw them watching us through the haze of road dust. My girlfriend and I joked about the up north people, but we didn't think anything of the encounter. Aside from those people, we didn't encounter anyone else on the remote logging roads within the national forest boundary. We found the trailhead about 15 minutes later, after winding our way on the narrow logging road. There was nobody else parked at the trailhead, a perfect chance to get some needed solitude, fresh air, and relaxation. After parking and making sure the car was locked, we hoisted our packs and set off on the trail. The weather was relatively cool, which thankfully kept the mosquitoes and biting flies at bay. We took pictures along the way, and we marveled at the lushness of the forest and the topography of the glacial moraine. After a solid 8 hours of hiking, we found our campsite. It consisted of a wooden backpack shelter and a fire ring. Even though the shelter provided ample space for us, we opted to set up our tent in a small clearing about 100 feet behind the shelter. We built a fire at the shelter fire ring, and I boiled water for our dehydrated trail food. As we ate, we watched the sky slowly turn dark. My girlfriend and I passed around an Nalgene filled with wine, and we marveled at how many stars you could see away from the city. When the fire was reduced to a small pile of glowing embers, we decided to head back to the tent. We settled into our tent and looked through the pictures we took that day. But after lugging a heavy pack for 15 miles and drinking some wine, I was ready for some shut-eye. When we camped at state and national parks, I usually wore earplugs. But that night, there were no RVs or other campers to make noise, so I closed my eyes and let the noise of the forest lull me to sleep. My girlfriend was very uneasy that night, but she normally had some apprehension whenever we were sleeping away from home. I'm not sure when we drifted to sleep, but we awoke to a bone-chilling noise. It was pitch dark outside, and over the insects in the forest, I heard a dull thud. It sounded like somebody was hitting two logs together. My girlfriend and I were wide awake at this point, and we lay silently in our tent hearing the noise again. Our old tent had mesh windows, but the backpacking tent we were using had no window. We could only guess at what was making the noise outside our tent. We initially thought an animal got out our food and garbage bag, which we left in the shelter, but the noise was too distinct, and it didn't sound like rustling through food wrappers or our camp equipment. Our hearts were pounding as we heard the persistent knock in the darkness. Unarmed and scared shitless, we didn't know what to do. I would normally have carried a can of bear spray, but I decided to leave it at home to save on weight, against the wishes of my girlfriend. Knocking continued, but we remained still as to not give away our location. For all we knew, whatever was making the noise had already spotted our tent. After what seemed like forever, the knocking sound ceased. We lay in complete silence with only the dull buzz of insects in the background. Then we heard it. Leaves rustling, a branch breaking, and voices. We heard low talking in the distance, but we couldn't make out what was being said. It sounded like a couple of voices talking in the distance. The voices continued for a bit, but to our relief, the voices didn't seem to be getting louder. Whoever was out there did not spot the tent or decided to leave us alone. We sat in our tent for the rest of the night, adrenaline surging through our veins. At the first light, we slowly got out of the tent. I looked around in all directions to see if anybody was out there, but I only saw the forest and the backpack shelter. We quickly rolled up our sleeping bags and camp pads and put our tent away. When we got to the shelter, my girlfriend screamed in horror. At the entrance to the shelter, the wood was freshly cut. The word kill was cut into the shelter wall, and there were a number of axe/knife cuts where somebody was chopping at the wall. I looked at the ground and saw a scattering of fresh wood splinters. After grabbing our food supply and garbage bag, we got the heck out of there. We were nearly jogging with our gear as we made our way back to the car. I kept glancing back over my shoulder and gazing out through the woods to see if anybody was following us. We traversed the glacial esker that we saw the day before, and we knew we were getting close to our car. We were quietly rejoicing as we neared the trailhead. We made it back to the trailhead in near record time, but something was wrong. The windshield wiper on my car was sticking straight up, and there was something stuck to the wiper. As we inched closer to the car, I saw there was blood smeared on the windshield and a squirrel carcass impaled on the wiper blade. Hair and blood were still stuck to the wiper and on the hood of the car. I didn't even bother cleaning off the car. We threw our gear in the trunk, and I sped off without removing the animal from the wiper blade. As I sped down the gravel logging road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see anything through the cloud of road dust behind the car. When we got to a gas station by the nearest town, I removed the carcass with a wad of newspaper and I tried to remove as much dried blood as I could. I filled up on gas and we didn't stop until we made it to Milwaukee. This was the last trip I took to the woods of northern Wisconsin. My dad is a logger, specifically one who operates a tree saw, which is basically a giant machine that is capable of cutting down massive trees and cutting them to a specific length, which means he spends a lot of time alone in the deep forests. The way my dad's logging crew was set up is that he would be told where he was supposed to cut down trees, and he would go do that and be paid based on the number of trees he cut, not on how long it took him. So my dad used to work 16 to 20-hour days constantly to get done as quickly as possible, and then the rest of the crew would come clean up the trees and ship them to the mill. He used to work around 50% of the time alone and the rest of the time with another tree saw operator named Renee. They would use radios to communicate back and forth when they were working together. This is relevant down the line. So sorry for all the backstory, but this is the start of the story. My dad and Renee were put on a new job site and were about 10 days in, and everything was going as planned. But they were constantly hearing weird chitter-chatter over the radio that was such poor quality, no words could ever be heard, and whatever radio channel they changed to followed them. As they progressed through the job and went farther up the mountain, the words from the radio slowly became more audible. Both of them agreed, based on the small parts of conversations they could hear, that something was wrong. They also started finding weird containers all over the place and signs that people had been there. People should not have been here. This was a 2.5-hour drive up a mountain. They had to spend 3 weeks clearing out the road so their trucks and equipment could make it up. They come to the realization that they're in a very secluded area with people who shouldn't be there, and the worst part is that they aren't scheduled to leave for about another week. They would only leave to refuel the fuel truck with gasoline for the machines. They would buy supplies and sleep in campers. One day, Renee comes across a tent and calls my dad over. They investigate the tent and find one lone sleeping bag and a duffel bag. They investigate the duffel bag and find many pairs of children's underwear and things that appear to be a murder kit, like rope, duct tape, disturbing images that I won't go into too much detail about, and photographs of people that appear to be unaware that they are being photographed. In the tent, they also find a small amount of food, which includes canned goods and an apple, which proves the tent has been occupied recently because there was no mold on the apple. They are now on the mountain alone with, at best, just a really messed up individual. Renee instantly wants to get the heck out of there, but my dad, being the hardest working person I've ever met, insists that they need to finish the job and get the heck out of there after. They decide that they will not talk over the radios except in cases of emergency and see if they can hear something over the radio. They are now in close enough range of whoever has been talking over it to hear the conversations between two men about collecting water and wood for the fire. Nothing abnormal except for the fact that these guys don't really belong here and that the tent was undoubtedly theirs. At the end of the workday, my dad hears them on the radio talking about one of them collecting brush for a fire. My dad hops on the radio and attempts to communicate with them about what the heck they are doing. I believe he said, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" After this conversation between the men abruptly stops and they never pick up. That night, Renee wakes my dad up and whispers for him to get his gun, because somebody's outside. My dad has told me that the first thing he hears when he wakes up is the quiet shuffling of footsteps. My dad fumbles for his gun and finds it, but realizes that he doesn't have it loaded and has little clue where his rounds are, and Renee has nothing, and the thought of calling the police was absurd for multiple reasons. They hear a jiggle on the doorknob, and it opens. The camper is far enough off the ground that you have to jump in, and there is no ladder or footstool. It just stays open, and neither my dad nor Renee moves. They hear scratching right outside the door, though. After only a few minutes of scratching, my dad can no longer take it and nods at Renee. He gets up quietly and walks towards the camper door, and the second he reaches it, he is met with intense pain across his right eye, all the way to his left cheek. He has been cut and falls out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. A man with a knife gets on top of him, and he is soon being kicked in the top of the head by a man behind him. Renee leaps out of the trailer and manages to get the man off my dad, and my dad gets up and realizes that the second man without the knife is running away, and the man with the knife is scrambling away from Renee and starts running alongside his accomplice. My dad and Renee get into the truck and drive to the nearest hospital to treat my dad's cuts and later report the events to the police. They both quit their jobs, and 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew was finishing up the job, one of them was found gagged, bound, possibly assaulted, murdered, and thrown into a ditch. No one has ever been convicted of these crimes. To this day, my dad can hardly see out of his right eye, and the pupil is disfigured and looks more like a cat's eye than a human's. He also suffers from PTSD from these events and hasn't slept a good night's sleep since. When I was a junior in college, my friend invited me to attend a ballet with her and a teenage girl that she knew from back home. The girl was part of an educational advancement program that had placed her in a nearby high school and provided free room and board in a group home with other students. All of her housemates had gone home for fall break, so my friend thought it would be nice to take her out for a girls' night, away from that big empty house with only her program advisor for company. It was about midnight when we got back from the ballet. Since we were in possession of a 16-year-old overdue for curfew, it seemed important to get her home as quickly as possible. The girl's house was fairly close to a student shuttle stop on the far end of the campus, so we figured we'd walk her home before doubling back. While moving up a footpath that leads into town, we realized her house backed up to the arboretum on the edge of campus. Rather than walk all the way around, we decided to cross the arboretum. We didn't have flashlights, but my friend's iPhone flash could serve in a pinch, and the stretch of woods was sandwiched between the brightly lit windows of our dorms and those of the houses across the way. Several minutes into our hike, we lost the sight of the footpath in the dorms. It was much darker now, and my friend was less certain that we were walking the right way, so we paused to check our location. As we were all huddled, motionless, around my friend's phone, we heard a twig crack behind us. We turned around to find a young woman, presumably a student, standing a few yards away. Her hoodie was pulled up over her head, obscuring most of her face. She seemed enormous, but given that I am only 5'3" and was flanked by 2 5-foot ballet dancers, the threshold for enormity was low. She was silent for a moment, then asked us where we were going. "We're heading into town," my friend answered. "Where are you going?" "What do you need in town?" "We're taking her home," my friend pointed to the teenage girl. "Where does she live?" "Not too far. Where are you going?" "Do you know how to get there?" She then started to walk closer to us. The teenage girl grabbed a fistful of my coat and inched closer to me. "Yeah, we figured it out. Are you going toward campus or into town?" "Which way is it?" "Her house." She was now within a few feet. Her approach had slowed but not yet stopped. My friend quickly blurted out, "Just this way. Good night." She was bluffing, but any direction away from the student seemed like the right direction, so we went along. The plan was a failure, because within seconds, I could hear her crunching the leaves just behind me. She was following close enough to touch me, and I sped up, certain I was about to get a knife in my spine if I didn't get away. When my friend saw me rushing, she turned back to see the student following us. She grabbed the teenager's hand, and the three of us began to run. We never turned back, so I'm not sure how long the student followed. Eventually, we figured out we were running the right way when the teenager yelled out, "Hey, that's it," and led us to a driveway where we could huff and puff ourselves back to normal, under a garage-mounted floodlight. The girl's program advisor was home, waiting up for her missing ward. Mant made us each a cup of tea while we waited for the campus police to drive out and escort me and my friend back to our dorm. Once safely in the back seat of a college security vehicle, we told the officer why we wanted to ride instead of walking back. He said this was the third time this semester they had picked up students running scared from the woods after encountering a strange girl in a hoodie. They dispatched officers to look into it before, but they never found anyone. He figured it was just a student on a stroll from the dorms and had nothing to worry about. As soon as we got out of the car, my friend got a text from the teenager. He was certain she'd seen the student outside her window, but when the program advisor went out to investigate, nobody was there. I never did find out what happened, but I really hope the creepy girl in the woods is not the same student whose body was found out there a year later. I hope she had nothing to do with that at all. Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on the orienteering expedition, which is basically a long trek through woodlands and rural villages, following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. Anyway, I was out of shape at the time and so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight like what I would have to during the real thing, but we hiked maybe 10 miles through woods and a small village and pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back to the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onward in silence at this point when all of a sudden, there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked to be late 70s, maybe early 80s, very pale with liver spots dotting his face and a gray-white comb over. I was instantly weirded out. I mean, who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought on seeing a guy his age out there in those clothes and those weather conditions was, this guy has absolutely lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice though, that puzzled me. The guy was bone dry and didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked at seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him and asking him if he was alright. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He started flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning us for him to follow, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After maybe a minute, he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him still, so we continued to follow the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us and pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down and the slope was probably at a 40-degree angle, spanned for perhaps 50 feet or more, and was slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto or anything. I remember looking down at the old man and on the other side of the slope and wondering, how the heck did he cross that so quickly and so cleanly? I mean, at that distance, it's hard to see fine detail clearly, but I swear he still didn't appear to be wet or muddy at all. My uncle and I looked at each other and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step toward the edge and was going to try and make my way down when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. Under his breath, he said to me, "Something's wrong here." We took a few steps back from the edge at this point and the old man at the bottom started getting irate. He began pleading with us again to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help and that his friend was in deep trouble. My uncle shouted down to the old man that he would head back to our car and call the emergency services for him, that professional help would be on its way soon, that they would have all the tools to help him, etc. The old man suddenly got furious and he began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right now or there would be hell to pay. His voice had changed drastically. He was practically growling his words, with his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out of their sockets, his skin gone from pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came, but his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter mile or so to the car. All the while, my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possible mentally ill old man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get to our car and await the police, so we would show them where we had encountered them. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them and packs of supplies like first aid, emergency blankets, etc. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed to the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through the bushes. The search lasted all weekend, but there was no trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. One of my weirdest experiences to date. This story happened about 2 years ago while I was in university working on my degree in biology. I had signed up for a trip to gather samples for an experiment some students in the ecology department were going to run. It required the collection of samples from several sites, so they recruited biology, ecology, and forestry majors to help them complete the sampling in a shorter period. The area my group was to take samples from was a few hours from a university in the Pacific Northwest. There are 9 of us in my group, 8 students and a supervising professor. We got to the campsite in the late evening and set up our tents. One of the other students had brought a big container of spilt pea soup from home and was sharing it with the others on the trip. I don't really care for split pea soup, so I declined the offer. Everybody had some except for me and one other student, and the professor. Come the next morning, the students who had eaten the soup weren't in the best of shape, like 5 of them. They were in the grips of some gnarly food poisoning and were in no shape to hike for 8 or 9 hours to collect the samples we needed. The professor who was supervising us originally had some rules, such as people traveling in groups of at least 2, and we had to return to camp by nightfall. Now, those rules were tossed out to make sure we kept to our timetable and collected all the required samples. We were just told to do your best to complete the work assigned as long as you can do it safely. That morning, I set out for a long day of hiking. After a mile or so, I ran into the stream that I was supposed to follow. I needed to travel about 4 miles upstream, stopping every quarter mile to collect samples of the water and soil. This meant I had to hustle to get back before dark. Halfway through the day, I realized that wasn't going to happen. About 2 miles into my hike, I stopped for lunch, sitting on a log overlooking the stream. The scene was really peaceful until I smelled the cigarettes. It wasn't the smell of a cigarette being smoked, more the musty smell of a heavy smoker's car where cigarette butts had been left to ferment for weeks on end. I looked around but couldn't see anyone. I just assumed that the wind had blown the scent of some hunter or hiker over to me. But minutes later, the smell hadn't faded. The vegetation in the area wasn't that thick, but there were still lots of places for somebody to duck behind a tree or bush. I was unnerved that somebody was apparently staying close enough to me for me to smell them for this long without so much as a word. I quickly packed up my trash for my lunch and continued up the stream. The musty cigarette smell went away for the next few hours. It wasn't until I arrived at my last sample location late into dusk that I smelled it again. The woods were getting really dim by this point. Looking back on it, it was a really stupid idea to stay out so late, as just hiking back to camp in the dark would be pretty dangerous even without a cigarette-smoking stalker. Having just put the collection tubes in my bag, I shined my flashlight around the darkening woods, looking for whoever was giving off that smell. I didn't see anything that caught my attention. It would actually be more correct to say I saw too many things in the dim light that might have been a head sticking out from behind a tree or somebody crouched low in the foliage. I didn't like the idea of being in the dark woods with a stranger who, for the second time, was lurking near me without revealing themselves. So I began to double time it back down the stream. I made much better time on my way back, even though it was dark, because I didn't have to stop to take any samples. Even so, I didn't get back to camp until a bit before 10. I was the last one to get back, and everybody but the professor was already asleep. I didn't mention the cigarette smell to the professor because he seemed tired as it was, and he headed to his bed in the RV soon after I got back. I headed to my tent soon after. At some point in the night, I woke up needing to pee. I decided to head into the woods to do my business as I knew some of the other students were still feeling ill and needed the RV toilet for more urgent matters than just having to take a leak. I walked about 100 feet into the woods, found a tree and did what I needed to do. As I turned to go back to camp, something caught my eye. Somewhere off in the woods was a tiny red glow. I was confused as to what it was until it flared momentarily, and I realized it was the cherry of a cigarette. I stood there for a while, watching the red ember glow and fade, then moved slightly closer to the ground, as whoever was smoking would take it out of their mouth. Not being able to see the person, I assumed they were watching the camp. I didn't know if they had seen me make my way into the woods or not, as the fire had been doused and the moon was only half full, so there really wasn't very much light. I made my way back slowly to camp as quietly as I could and entered the RV to wake up the professor. I told him about the person smoking in the woods and about the smell of cigarettes earlier that day. However, when we got outside the RV, the ember from the cigarette was gone. My professor woke the other student who hadn't come down with food poisoning, and we took turns watching over camp. I didn't see or smell anything else when I was on guard duty, and I went to sleep when the professor woke up for his turn. In the morning, the professor, the other student, and I went to where I guessed the smoker had been standing the night before, and sure enough, we found about 10 cigarette butts on the ground next to a tree. The tree itself looked like somebody had been twisting and stabbing a knife or other sharp object into it, as the bark and outer layers of wood had been damaged and chipped away. The professor decided that the group should head back that day, even though we hadn't collected all the samples and were assigned to be on the safe side. We packed up camp and drove down the thin dirt trail without incident. The second we got onto the paved highway, though, a white paneled van pulled out of a clearing just off the shoulder and began following us. This van stayed behind us all the way back, pulling off the highway when we did, taking the same surface streets that we did, and only stopped following us when we turned onto the road leading to the university campus. Everyone was freaked out by this, but it was around 9 at night on a weekend, so the security office on campus was closed. We decided to unload the RV and call it a night, as the van hadn't followed us onto campus. I offered to help the professor catalog and store the collection tubes from our trip, so it was another couple of hours before I left the biological sciences building and started heading toward the dorm building I lived in. I stepped out into the cool night air and began walking, my professor having left the building in the other direction to get to his car and drive home. I was a couple dozen feet outside of the building, which was now locked, when I was hit with the musty smell of old cigarettes. I looked around, and about 25 yards away in the darkness of the footpath, I saw the cherry of a cigarette smoldering away. I was pretty scared at this point, but hoped it was only a student or some faculty staying late having a smoke, although I couldn't completely convince myself of this, as the musty cigarette smell was the same as what I smelled in the woods the previous night. I started down the footpath and soon passed whoever was smoking. 100 feet or so later, I looked over my shoulder and saw the cigarette cherry bobbing in the darkness. The smoker was following me. This creeped me out a bit more, but I still held it together. That is, until I rounded a small stand of trees and saw a white paneled van parked alone in a parking lot. I took off at a sprint toward my dorm building. I looked over my shoulder a few steps into my run. I saw the cherry of the cigarette fall to the ground and a dark shape beginning to move after me. I didn't look back again, but I could hear somebody running in the grass of the footpath. I got to the entrance to my dorm building and frantically waved my key card in front of the card reader that controlled the door lock. As soon as I hear the soft beep, I opened the door, jumped through the doorway, and shut the door quickly. I stopped and peered through the glass door, and I saw the dark shape stop just short of the lit pathway. I just watched for a minute or two, then I saw the spark of a lighter. The light was just barely bright enough to illuminate a shaggy beard and the brim of a baseball cap, before it disappeared and was replaced with the red glow of a cigarette. I turned and headed up the stairs to my dorm room. By the time I got to my window overlooking the same yard I had just run through, there was no trace of a dark figure or a cigarette cherry. After that, I didn't see that white paneled van again or smell that musty cigarette smell, and I hope I never have to. My grandfather murdered people and liked to bury their dismembered corpses in their own gardens. It would be unfair to call him a serial killer though, because his murders were so prolific and had no real modus operandi. If he couldn't bury them in the garden, he would simply bury them somewhere in the woods. He wasn't organized or attached the way most serial killers are. Still, he was never arrested, never caught for his crimes. I was a quiet kid with workaholic parents. My folks were never there, and I was left with relatives a lot growing up, which is why I ended up spending a lot of time with my grandfather, my mother's father. When I was 7 years old, my grandfather took me hunting. It wasn't the kind of hunting where you brought home a deer or a rabbit. Instead, he was going to show me exactly how to deliver a blow to another human's head and then dismember them while they were unconscious but still alive. My first kill was supposed to be a boy around my age who had wandered too close to the edge of the woods. He was kicking a ball into a tree. My grandfather nudged me and pointed in the boy's direction. Obediently, I did as my grandfather said. A I walked over to the other boy and smiled widely, keeping my face warm and open. Just as my grandfather taught me. Innocent. "Hi," I said to the boy. I clutched the baseball bat in my hand. He was wearing a red baseball cap and a pair of blue shorts, and he smiled at me. A big grin with 2 front teeth missing. I think that was what stopped me. That was what made me release my grip on the baseball bat, and I slowly set it down. It was strange, but I felt my grandfather's glare at that moment, his eyes boring into my back. Panic rose in my throat, thinking that he was going to strike me. Instead, he did something infinitely worse. He killed the boy instead. I remember numbly sitting in his truck on the drive home. He alternated between shouting at me and calling me a coward while extrapolating joy at his own kill. My fear was palpable. My grandfather was in a state of euphoria and fury. That was the last time I saw my grandfather alive. He was killed in a hit and run a week later. I never told a soul about the butchery I had seen in my childhood. Part of me convinced myself that I had it wrong, that I had invented that version of my grandfather because I had misunderstood things. He couldn't have been a killer, I rationalized. He would have been caught. I wish that my rationality had been right, and that would be the end of that. I wish that I didn't have to tell you about the rest of this. But my grandfather died 23 years ago, and 4 days ago on my 30th birthday, I received a gift. It was delivered in an inconspicuous parcel. My name and address and marker pen. It had no return address, and had I known who it was from or what it was, I would have thrown it out. Instead, I took it to my kitchen table along with the rest of my mail and opened it up. There was no note inside the package, just a sealed box. Carefully, I lifted it up and opened it with my penknife. The leather-bound, blood-stained notebook stared back at me, and a sick feeling clawed its way into my stomach. Curiosity, however, won out. I lifted the notebook and, grimacing at the crackle of the pages, opened it to the first page, which just had a name. William Ronald Harrow. That was my grandfather's name. My heart began to thud against my chest, and my hand shook as I turned the page. Written in what I had horrible suspicion was dried blood was a name and a date. Gregory Sanders, June 12, 1981. What followed after the name was the most graphically detailed description of murder I have ever read. The thrill the killer took in severing this man's hands first, the joy he felt in pulling out his vocal cords, how long he kept his victim alive. The torture, man, the pain he subjected that poor man to. I turned the page. Another name. Another incredibly graphic death. While reading it, a wave of nausea overcame me, and as I turned page after page, the strong smell of iron made me drop the book back in its box so I could run to the bathroom and throw up. When I came back, I stood stock still at the kitchen door. The diary had moved. It was no longer in the box. Instead, it sat open at the kitchen counter, lying open on the last page. Look, I live alone. The front door was locked. Nobody else had a key after my ex-girlfriend moved out, and I changed the locks. A cold sweat broke out all over my body. I felt like I was 7 again. Slowly, I made my way to the kitchen counter. I placed my clammy hand on the book and pulled it closer. The last page listed a name that made me blink several times. William Ronald Harlow, June 1st, 1999. That was my grandfather's name and his date of death. I swallowed hard. What the heck was going on? Slowly I read on. The contents of the page were sickening. In brief, his tongue was cut out, his eyes taken, and he was tortured for 3 days. I pushed the book away and sat down heavily on a kitchen chair, my head spinning. But he died in a car accident, didn't he? That's why there was a closed casket. The realization suddenly swelled in my mind, and I began to realize why there was a closed casket. It was because he had been tortured. Quickly, I grabbed the diary and my keys and drove to my parents' place. I knew they would be sitting down to have dinner around now, but I didn't care. I let myself into the house and found them in the living room. Sam, what's wrong?" my mother asked me, getting up too quickly and letting her book fall to the floor. "How did Granddad die?" I didn't mince my words. I didn't have the brain power to do that anymore. "And don't tell me it was a hit and run," I added forcefully. "What?" My father was standing up too now, his hand on my shoulder. I was breathing hard, and my body was a mix of fear and fury. "Don't," I told my father sharply. "I just want the truth." I turned to my mother. "How did he die?" My mother's eyes went from confusion to sadness. "Oh, Sam, you really don't remember, do you?" "Remember what?" I asked in frustration. "What he did to Adrian." Her words were slow and halting, and they still managed to make their mark. Who is Adrian? As soon as I asked the question, I realized I didn't want to know the answer, but it was too late. The room was still as my mother began to cry. Adrian was your younger brother. He loved you so much and followed you everywhere. And your grandfather killed him. I couldn't process this. I didn't have any siblings. I was an only child. Mom, I don't remember. No, you don't, and that's a good thing, my mom said quietly. The doctor said it's best if you don't remember that day. It's why we have no photos of Adrian around the house, and it's why we moved to another town where nobody knew us or your grandfather. It was so much easier for you to forget. So what happened to him? My voice sounded high and unnatural even to myself. Your grandfather was a sick man, my mom said, her gentle gray eyes hardening with a hate that made me step back from her. And he got what was coming to him. I looked between her and my father, the cold truth dawning on me. You're saying that we did what we had to do, what any parent would do, said my father, the iciness in his voice chilling me to the core. You didn't have to torture him, I said numbly, unable to believe that my parents were saying these words. We didn't have to. My mother's eyes glinted with something dangerous, but we wanted to. I stumbled back from my parents. Who sent me the diary? What diary? My mom asked. This one, I said as I slammed it onto the coffee table. My mom picked up the diary and flipped through the pages. I don't understand. Why are you showing this to us? What? I was incredulous, but then I noticed the pages. They were blank. In fact, the whole book seemed to have been wiped clean somehow. My head ached. How old was he? I asked softly. How old was Adrian? My father was taking a folded photograph out of his wallet, his eyes etched into such pain as he looked at me and handed it over. That's the last photo of you two together. It was an old photograph of me and the boy I assumed was my brother. He was smiling, a big smile with his two front teeth missing, and wearing a red baseball hat with blue shorts. So about 5 years ago, I, male 26, set out to travel the world. Being straight out of college had left me in debt, even more desperate for any job I was overqualified for, and generally depressed. I felt isolated and alone in my small town in Washington and found the only way to get out: travel. My high school buddy suggested I look into woofing and volunteering as a way to travel cheap, and so I did. The way it works is quite simple. You work for around 25 hours a week on some farm for food and housing. The draw is that since the community of cheap-ass travelers is quite big, it is a great way to meet new people, get outside of your comfort zone, and just let yourself live and figure life out. Fast forward 8 months and I am a seasoned cow dung shoveler. I started out in Washington and Oregon and went south to California. There, I was able to save some money I was paid under the table for, some extra work, and was now faced with a decision: where to go in the world. The excitement of being able to purchase a ticket to almost anywhere in the world got the best of me, and on the advice of my dumbass hippie volunteering partner, I chose it at random. I went to a randomizer website and clicked the country button. Georgia. The country of Georgia. To say I didn't know anything about it was an understatement, but the fear of the unknown made it exciting and exotic somehow, and so I did it. I purchased the ticket and started browsing for a farm that could host me. There were few options, and most were remote and didn't even have an internet connection. I messaged every single one because few ever respond, and got a response from one farm on top of a mountain. The picture showed a traditional Georgian stone house with a large garden out in the back, a family with several cheerful children, and grandparents having dinner and animals. It seemed warm and inviting. The description was written in good English, and the requirements for work seemed reasonable. I was excited. After I flew into Tbilisi, the capital, I followed the directions that they had sent to locate the farm, which wasn't an easy task. Few in Georgia speak English. The roads are screwed since few have been maintained since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country is generally poor. It took me around 20 hours of Soviet buses and taxis and weird serpentine roads and paths to get to that desired blue pen on my map. It was a dirt path leading up a steep hill into a national park, up in the north of the country. There was nothing for miles on end but trees in their silence. As I got up that hill, I saw the house about half a mile away on an even steeper hill, surrounded by the trees. From that viewpoint, it seemed abandoned, overgrown, brown and dreary. As I walked past the gate, Geary, fake name, the apparent owner, approached me. He was a heavy, small middle-aged guy with a big smile on his face. He shook my hand and, in broken English, started to show me around. He smelled of booze. As he was showing me around, I noticed that there wasn't anyone there but us. I asked about his wife and kids, and he brushed that aside and said something to the extent of, "Oh, they're away right now." By this point, I'm pretty creeped out. From browsing around, it was apparent that the farm was in deep decline. Apple trees and crops were dying. The roof of the small barn caved in, and the house itself was full of trash and smelled of mold. It was obvious that Geary was going through a rough patch, but I wasn't going to turn around and just leave in the middle of nowhere, without a plan, having not slept for the past 36 hours. It was evening, and after feeding me well and trying as best as he could to hold a conversation in English, Geary showed me my room on the second floor, and I went to sleep. I almost immediately blacked out from the exhaustion and stress, and would have slept for 10 hours if I hadn't been awakened by a strange noise in the middle of the night. It sounded like something metallic and heavy was being dragged across the wooden floor. In that sleepy in-between state, I listened to it for a few minutes, thought nothing of it, and went back to sleep once it stopped. In the morning, Geary, now sober and grumpy, asked me to repair some of the windows and doors in the house, as he himself planned to go and fetch some components in a nearby village. Again, I got this weird feeling creeping down my spine. Something just wasn't right. He didn't maintain eye contact and was evasive. There was no cell reception, no internet. Once he left, I checked around the house to get a general idea of the place, and it became apparent that the place was hardly ever lived in. Like one of those abandoned houses, there was broken furniture, newspapers and old photos on the floor, and a shattered mirror. I took my phone and looked through the saved listing again. The photos didn't match the backyard, the garden, or the walls. Geary wasn't in any of them. It was a completely different house. Now, by this point, I am full-blown panicking. I pack my stuff up and start to leave when I see a group of 3 men going up that first hill. There aren't any other paths I can take, so I go behind the house and rush down this hill into the forest. After some time, I stop and listen. I hear them in the house. They are clearly looking for me. Afraid of making any noise, I remain still, hidden behind a bush. I don't know how long I waited, but they were persistent. At some point, I hear them leave, so I count until some large number and proceed back into the house and path. And once I find it's all clear, I book the heck out of there. I've never ran that fast in my life, but I am still in the middle of nowhere. No traffic, no public transport. I finally reached a paved road and start walking in the general direction from where I remember coming. Hours go by and finally a car drives by and stops. Now in a horror movie, this would have been Geary and his friends, but this was actually a really nice Russian family that gave me a ride to town. The listing disappeared from the website a few days after I left, and I haven't heard from Geary since. I've yet to make sense of that experience. I have traveled since and volunteered too. Some people, once they hear this story, laugh and say that the guy was coming over with a couple of friends from the village to have a chat over a few beers. Some say he was bound to kidnap and kill me. But I trust my gut feeling. Something was really not right. This takes place in October 1977. When my mom was 16, she ran away from her abusive home along with her friend Lisa. They hitchhiked from Mass all the way to California. Obviously, this wasn't the brightest of plans, but given my mom's tumultuous home life and past experiences, she didn't see how it could be much more dangerous than anything she'd already experienced. They had a pretty safe and uneventful trip across the country, finding friends and mini truck drivers and other travelers. It wasn't until they'd reached California when this encounter happened. The hillside strangler, at first thought to be one assailant, ended up being 2 men who were caught and brought to justice for 10 murders. So, my mom and Lisa end up meeting these 2 guys who were super nice to them. They crashed at their place for a few days, partying. But nothing bad had come of it at this point. These guys tell the girls that they're going to take them to the Hollywood Hills and Sunset Boulevard to see the sights. Not being from the area, my mom had no idea that these areas were more crime-ridden at the time. especially considering that they were supposed to be sightseeing. My mom really wanted to see where all the movie stars lived. These guys take my mom and her friend to some divey restaurant or bar and get them super drunk. It's also the first time my mom is introduced to and tries cocaine. After these underage girls are now completely high and drunk, they split off into pairs and my mom's friend disappears with one of these guys. My mom is now hanging out with just one of her new guy friends. He then suggests that they stand on the sidewalk on Sunset Boulevard in the middle of the night and if/when a car pulls up, she should get in and direct the driver to drive across the street to the Stark parking lot. It isn't really until the first and only car pulls up and she gets in that she realizes this guy is prostituting her out. Keep in mind, these guys had been nothing but kind and respectful to my young mom and friend for the past few days. Also, and very sadly, this type of abuse is not a new concept for her either. She gets into this car and instead of pulling into the parking lot, he keeps driving straight. My mom explains that he's gone the wrong way, so he starts driving faster. My mom moves toward the door, but he locks it, hits her, and attempts to hold her down all at the same time. He tells her she isn't going anywhere. My mom knew in her head she needed to get out of that car or she'd be dead. So in one swift move, she unlocks the door and tucks and rolls out of the car. His car comes screeching to a halt. She sees some bushes in front of a house, so she runs to hide behind them. He's turned around looking for her, creeping along. His passenger side was facing where she was hiding and she was peeking through the bushes. She saw he had a gun. As soon as his car crept by, she ran to the backyard. It was all fenced in. There was no other way out, so she had to go back the way she came. By the time she crawled back into the bushes to see if he was still around, she saw his car had gone to the end of the road and turned back around. So he passes again, and when she thought he was far enough away, she crawled out of the bushes to run. But then she sees his brake lights. Confident that he's now seen her, she runs as fast as possible around the corner, but she could hear his car, so she had to duck and hide behind parked cars on the road. As soon as he passed again, she booked it across the street, which took her through the parking lot she was originally supposed to park in and back to her friend. The creep did circle back again, but by then she was with her friend and they were leaving the area. My mom and her friend quickly ditched these two assholes and did find a safer place to stay. But only a short time later did my mom call home and eventually make it home safely. It wasn't until a long time later that she saw on the news a story about women being murdered and recognized the murderer, dubbed the Hillside Strangler, as the man who had picked her up that night. A side note, my mom literally just dictated this story to me. I've heard it before, but not in so much detail. She said that I should share her story. Not purposefully, but I googled an image of the Hillside Strangler and showed her. Unexpectedly, my phone, and she jumped so high. It actually really unnerved her, recognizing him again, and I felt bad about that. Edit. It was Kenneth Bianchi who drove the car this night. My mom said there is no questioning it was his distinguishing features and definitely his mustache. Edit 2. I've been reading these comments to my mom. Retelling her story to me so I could accurately account for it has stirred some anxiety and feelings in her that she didn't realize were there. So she just wants to say a genuine thank you for all of the well wishes and positive comments. I hope she finds comfort in knowing that, although it was because of poor choices, hitchhiking and drinking with strangers, her actions show how truly brave and strong she actually is. Honestly, I'm so grateful for her. She's the most amazing woman I've ever known. I wasn't allowed to write about this story for several months while the investigations were still ongoing, but now I finally can, and I recommend that if you still live in your childhood room or if you occasionally keep going back, that you stop listening here. It's hard enough to still feel your childhood fears, but it's even worse to know that it wasn't your imagination. So please go and listen to something else. But I just need to get this out, and since some people here like to be scared, I figured it's a good way to get it out. Okay, you are still with me. I know that many of you are still young, but you too will encounter this. You move out with flying colors only to miss your childhood home, to remember things that were nice, and on occasion, to remember those weird fears you had when you were young. Like monsters hiding under your bed, or shadows moving outside the window, scratching sounds from your wardrobe, or, like me, noises from a room that you know should be empty. For me, it was always the attic. My room was the top floor room. There were two doors. One led to the staircase and downwards, and the other was an attic hatch, a scuttle door with pull-down stairs. Our attic was barely used. We moved things inside once or twice when we moved into the house, but from then on, the attic was maybe visited every 1 or 2 years, usually to store more things, rather than to retrieve anything. Needless to say, I was scared of this second opening in my room. Few things are scarier than a room right above your head from which you keep hearing odd noises that sound like footsteps, shuffling noises, and sometimes weak voices. My only solace was always that I knew that there was no way to get out of the attic. Of course, there was also only one way to get in, through my room. But more important to me was that nothing could get out, that those things that kept me from sleeping couldn't really do anything to me. This attic and its strange noises kept me from sleeping many times. I imagined scary murders, vengeful ghosts, and satanic cults, and many other things up there. And with my overactive imagination, I heard for months how they did their strange rituals or threatened to murder me. Most traumatic was always when I heard them rattling at the hatch, when I thought that they were trying to get me. I remember a phase when I must have been around 13 or 14 when my fears were getting more intense. During that time, probably 4 or 5 months, I would lie awake for hours, horrified by the movements, the voices, and the chains rattling above my head. Whenever I told my parents about the noises in my attic, they would just laugh at me and tell me to grow up. It didn't even worry them when I stayed away from my room even during the safety of daylight. I don't know how that phase ended. I just noticed that at some point the noises were gone. It seemed to me even as if the level of noise was less than ever before, but that is difficult to say now. It is strange to think that since then nobody must have been in our attic. A few months back, at the beginning of 2012, my parents asked me for a favor, to clean out the attic. From the safety of my home, far away from home, I said yes. When I finally returned to my childhood home for a long weekend, to exactly clean out the attic, I had even successfully convinced myself that this was a good idea, that it would be a means to cleanse my spirit and to prove to myself that those fears had just been childish fears and to finally cure myself of the nervousness and dread I feel in the dark. Boy, was I wrong. I arrived on Thursday night, had a short welcome back conversation with my parents, and then went straight to bed. That's when it all came back to me. The fears, the sounds I thought I heard, and the memories of hiding under my pillows while monsters and cults were dangerously close to my head. This was also the first moment that I remember dust falling out of the ceiling. I must have suppressed that memory, but with my adult mind, this indeed seemed odd. In an untouched room, there is no real movement or pressure. There's no reason for clouds of dust to fall out between the wooden planks that make the ceiling. Regular, steady dust, yes, that's normal, but sudden bursts happening at the same time as thudding noises, that's certainly not normal. I had a restless sleep, memories of chains rattling, rhythmic thumps, and muffled conversations or screams dominated my dreams. On Friday, I spent all morning procrastinating the inevitable task until my mother gently reminded me what I promised to do. Go up there and clean out the attic. So I went, got some cleaning materials, a vacuum, brooms, and a few empty boxes to store everything in, and stared at the hatch for a solid minute before I finally mustered the courage to get the long wooden stick with the attached hook that would help me pull down the hatch. I laced the hook into the ring mounted on the hatch and pulled. A loud creaking sound. The hatch moved a bit, then metallic clonking, and it was stuck. Great. I got a chair, stepped on it, and tried to pull the door with my bare hands. It moved a bit more, but it still didn't want to open, and every time I pulled it, it seemed to make an odd metallic sound. Were the pull-down stairs jammed against the edge of the hole? I didn't have a light, so rather than try to see what it was, I just pushed my hand inside and felt around, and found something I didn't expect. A chain. I mean, I was young the last time I had been up there, but I don't remember my parents ever putting chains or other heavy stuff up there. I was just far too burdened to carry it all up there. It should have been a warning sign, or maybe I should at least have asked my parents about it before I proceeded. But I was fairly sure that the chain was not part of the stairs and that whatever was up there couldn't be very valuable. So I went, got a bolt cutter, and with its sharp claws quickly cut the chain in a few places. I tried again to pull the hatch down, and this time, with some extra force, it worked. I was surprised though, when the long chain fell down on the floor next to me. It really was long and thick, nothing that my parents had ever had a reason to put up there. That should have been the second warning sign. The smell that came towards me should have been the third warning, an incredibly strong rotting smell mixed with the old, stale, and dusty air that I had expected. My parents never intended to use the attic much, so The lighting up there had always been improvised. You had to put your hands up, fumble for a cable that you had to pull down, and plug into a normal power plug in my room. Then the light would go on. I know that my parents usually placed that cable on the pull-down stairs so that it would come right down when you open the hatch itself. But for some reason, this time that hadn't happened. The cable was still up there, and so I had to fumble. I pulled the stairs down fully, stepped on the first few steps, careful not to get my head too far into the opening as the smell made me gag, and felt around with my hand to find the cable. I nearly had my whole arm inside and was already touching something dry and leathery that I identified as my dad's old clothes, but the cable was nowhere to be found. So, still determined to let the attic air out a bit before I would fully go up there, but gripped by determination to get this annoying light to work, and through it, maybe to eliminate some of my fears that the cold draft from up there had reawakened. I could already feel all the monsters of my sleepless childhood nights creep back up to me, watching me while I sleep or drumming weak messages for me. I got my dad's heavy and bright emergency flashlight, climbed up the ladder, stuck my head inside the attic and turned it on. I don't remember if the light didn't illuminate much of the room or if it was simply my gaze that was limited, but right in front of my face was the mummified body of a young girl. I think her eyes will always haunt me. Not the chains that were around her neck and arms, not the look of fear in her mouth, or the way her teeth seemed broken out by the chain, pulled through her mouth. No, just the look in her dried eyeballs. Not closed, just open eyes that seemed to be staring at me. The fear and pain in those eyes, fixated right upon my face, still haunts me no matter whether I am asleep or just fade out during the day. She comes back to me with that look that seemed like blame and guilt and pain and, at the same time, hope. Hope to be found. The police took more than half an hour to come. I guess old cases are not that interesting. What they found is not much less disturbing than what I already saw. They said she was chained down, the body at least a decade old, and she must have been assaulted many times, and they found far too many bruises on her body. They arrested my neighbor until they realized that they had only moved in recently and that the old neighbor that had lived next to us as long as I can remember had died 5 years prior. I used to remember him as a kind, friendly man that always shared sweets or funny stories with me. Now I remember him as the guy that cut a hole from his attic to ours, to torture, assault, and do whatever else with a helpless girl. The case is closed, so I can talk about it now. The investigation is conclusive. They are sure it was my neighbor. I don't have to be scared of him anymore. But I still see her, nearly every day, with her eyes full of fear and pain and blame. She must have known that I lived right below her. And I know that when I was 14, I wasn't just a paranoid child. I didn't know it back then, but I thought it was a cult or ghost or vengeful spirits that made rattling noises and tapped messages on the woods, rattled on the hatch, or tried to talk to me. But what I heard was her living and suffering up there for 4 or 5 months. When I was about 8 years old, my parents were going through a divorce, and I and my older sister used to spend a lot of time at our grandparents' house. It's a long ranch-style home on a corner in a very nice neighborhood that's a 10-minute walk from a gas station, grocery store, and a few fast food restaurants. The streets are long and lined with well-manicured houses, cradled by big, scenic California valley hills all around. We were never very wealthy, but my grandpa bought it as a fixer-upper many years ago, and the property value has skyrocketed since then. As you can imagine, it's a very safe spot, and although there weren't many other kids in the neighborhood, it wasn't uncommon to see neighbors walking their dogs or pushing a stroller down the sidewalk outside our house. Although my mom was especially protective all of our lives, this particular neighborhood was densely populated, and my family knew just about everyone who lived there. She grew up in that neighborhood herself, so she was understandably trusting. She would once in a while let me and my sister walk to the Rotten Robbie gas station on the other end of the block to grab a snack. I would almost always get a ring pop and my sister would grab a Three Musketeers before we made our way back home. My sister was about 11 at the time, and this small amount of freedom was a really big deal to us. Nothing compared to walking down that street all by ourselves in the summertime, laughing and joking around, a couple dollar bills in our pockets. I felt like I owned the world. The one oddity I ever noticed around the neighborhood was a small camper parked on the side of the road opposite to the gas station, right along the back side of the fence of another house. It sat there in the shade like a permanent fixture, all the windows constantly covered by opaque beige curtains. I can't explain it, but it always gave me this deep sense of foreboding when I'd pass it. I was almost positive somebody was living inside it because, at times, I'd hear the air conditioning running as it sat stagnant in that same spot. The hairs on my neck would always stand on end as I passed it, particularly as I passed the camper door, and I'd always keep an eye on it for fear that one day it'd swing open just as I came to pass by. I think what bothered me the most was a drawing taped to the door from the inside. It was extremely messy, a sketch of odd lines in a brown-colored pencil that was frustratingly indiscernible. I could see the outline of something, a vague shape, but could never make out what it was intended to be. I never had the nerve to stop and stare long enough to really investigate, but each time I walked by, I'd steal a glance. A year prior to the incident I'm about to describe, I was walking with my mom past the camper in the shade. We had just gone to the park nearby and, unfortunately, had to pass the camper before we could cross the street and continue walking. I didn't want to seem afraid, so I kept on walking right behind her and didn't object when she walked past it. This time I felt a little braver. I was frustrated not being able to decipher the drawing for so long, and while my mom was feet away, I stopped in front of the camper door and took a moment to really look at the drawing. Upon closer inspection, the paper was filthy. I remember doing a project in elementary school where we soaked printer paper in black coffee to make it look aged, and that's what it reminded me of. My mom walked on without noticing I stopped following her, but my eyes stayed fixed on the indistinct mass of dirt-caked scribbles until I could make out what looked to be a tiny, malformed face. My stomach turned. I immediately felt cold and disgusted as my eyes trailed over the rest of the image. I didn't know what kind of creature it was at the time, but now I can look back and say that the drawing was a badly deformed fetus inside a mass of large perfect circles, like those made by a circular ring ruler. Its face was contorted as if in pain. It was so graphically disturbing and seemed to portray this odd sense of suffering that stuck with me for days. As a child, I didn't know how to process it though, and the mental image still makes me sick to think about. I'd never seen anything like it before. Adrenaline flooded my body and my chest hurt with fear, but I selfishly thought of my glorious little trips for ring pops and said absolutely nothing as I followed behind my mom. This was, in retrospect, a classically terrible idea. It's one of those things you scream at main characters in movies for. Ever since my ill feelings toward the camper had been elevated by the drawing on the door, I thought about it every time we drove by, and about a month later, my mom once again graced us with several bucks and permission to walk down to Rotten Robbie and grab our respective snacks. I thought about telling my sister about what I'd seen on the way there, but she was older and braver, and I was terrified she'd make me cross the street with her to check it out. It was a bright, sunny day, and I told myself with false certainty that nothing was going to happen. If I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it'd go away. We walked past the camper, and it was thankfully uneventful. On the walk back, I was feeling more comfortable and was focused on fighting open my candy wrapper, while my sister walked alongside me. I passed the camper a second time, but I didn't give it half as much thought as the first time. I don't even remember what we were talking about, but I recall being interrupted mid-sentence as my sister softly yet firmly said my name. There was a distinct fear in her voice that immediately set me on edge, like a bucket of ice water. All my senses heightened, and I became aware of everything, including the sound of haphazard footsteps about 10 feet behind us. It was accompanied by a heavy rustling sound like a heavy backpack, and nervously, I half turned my head to look. A man with a long, unkempt beard and wearing many layers of ragged clothing stood behind us, eyes unmistakably burning into our backs as he walked. His movements weren't normal. It was a drunken shuffle, like each one of his feet was unimaginably heavy and needed to be moved with one grand effort at a time. His shoulders were skewed and his head was tilted downward with a strange arc of his neck. I could hear his shoes scraping the gravel with every step, but rather than seemingly genuinely intoxicated, it was as if he was intentionally meandering in our direction, like a zombie, with a direct effort to frighten us. Behind him, I saw the camper door was wide open for the first time in all the years we'd spent living there, and realized this was the man who had been living inside. "He's following us," I choked out, my eyes filling with tears. My mind was spinning as I stared straight ahead again, the wide street and sidewalks abnormally empty all around. My sister grabbed my hand. She squeezed it hard enough to hurt without looking my way, speaking carefully under her breath. On the count of 3, we race home. She told me in a very serious tone of voice. I couldn't reply through the growing lump in my throat, but every single cell in my body understood we had to put some distance between us and this man as quickly as possible. She began to count steadily while we walked faster, and the most terrifying part is that he started running before we even had a chance to. He must have heard her directions to me and tried to get a head start by sprinting in our direction before she got to 3. But his footsteps were noisy, and we bolted like deer the instant we heard him behind us. I will never forget it. The chase felt exactly like you can imagine in your nightmares. The fear your pursuer is inches away from grabbing your arm or a fistful of your hair. I pictured myself being dragged into the van with nobody around to see or hear me. We ran so fast that we didn't even have the breath to scream, and peering back behind me about 10 seconds later, I saw him running in our direction with absolutely none of the impairment he showed with those zombie-like steps moments before. I think back on it now, and he may have been deliberately pretending to be handicapped to lower our guard so we wouldn't start running. That thought is terrifying, but I can't rationalize it any other way. We made it to our grandparents' house, and without looking behind us, yanked open the stubborn old door before slamming it closed and scrambling past their excited dogs to get as deep in the house as possible. I don't even think we locked it, as our main goal was getting within the line of sight of any adults as quickly as possible. My mom was talking to my grandpa at the table and gave us an amused look when we bounded into the living room. Since we were kids, running around wasn't anything out of the ordinary, and she didn't ask what happened as we collapsed on the couch and tried to catch our breath. The inside of the house felt so safe, and I felt in such good spirits that I didn't even want to bring up what had just happened. Like waking up from a nightmare you didn't want to talk about. I was desperate to go back to normalcy. I wanted to forget it entirely, to unwrap my candy and act like everything was completely normal for the sake of my own sanity, and that's what I did. I asked my sister a few years back if she remembered this incident. I'm 25 and she's 28 now, and her response was strange. She remembered immediately without the need for me to provide details, but she quickly waved it off and insisted that he had to have been a bored homeless man looking to spook some kids walking home with no real intent to harm anyone. I don't know. I like to believe it's some innocent misunderstanding, but like they always say about gut feelings, they are rarely wrong. I feel in my soul that he wanted to hurt me and my sister that day. Never told her or anybody else about the strange drawing on the door, and I'm not sure if my sister saw the open door and connected him to the camper or not. But it's one of my biggest regrets, as I would hate for any other children to have been less fortunate after innocently walking past the camper in the shade. I believe he may have chosen the spot between the park and gas station deliberately, due to the number of children walking around the area. Never saw the camper again, a day or so after this. I'm not proud of how I handled this and would encourage anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation to contact authorities immediately for the safety of others around. I don't know if maybe this whole story comes off as melodramatic, but it was very real and very frightening in a way that I can't forget.